There are a number of different books that by reading them, it can help you to truly understand the world. The world today is so complex, so ambiguous, so difficult to grasp. And in this episode of the Change Your Minds podcast, I want to walk you through 16 big idea books that will change the way you think about the world, that will help you to understand more about how the world works. These are excellent books written by a variety of different authors, and I know they're going to help you to become even more sane. Ready to go? Let's do it. Hi, I'm Owen Fitzpatrick and welcome to another episode of the Change Your Minds podcast. Today we're going to be talking about big idea books that help us to explain how the world works. This is, of course, another part of the Big Ideas series where each week I'm taking lots of different books and extracting from them the most important insights, or one of the most important insights from them, as the big ideas that we need to reflect on, consider, and of course apply in the way in which we cope with the world today. And none better than what we have to explore today. And we're going to start by a book called Enshittification by Cory Doctorow. And Enshittification was coined by Cory to describe the predictable lifestyle of digital platforms. And it's, in a nutshell, he says that all digital platforms, they pretty much go through three phases. Number one, and he talks about social media here in a lot of ways, they're really good to users. So it's like great opportunities are there to use social media to connect with each other, a massive amount of value. Then it goes through the bait and switch where they prioritize business users. And then finally, it's the squeeze phase where it's now that we've gotten all the users, now that they're dependent on us, now we can start to prioritize the organization, the company. And so the internet, with lots of interruptions, with hyperlinks, with multitasking, it's not designed to help us to improve our thinking. It's not designed for deep contemplative thinking. And so the world, in many ways online, is full of a lot of crap, a lot of rubbish. And Doctorow has a very fascinating way of looking at this. He's been talking about this for a number of years, but the book is really encapsulates what it means to be online in the modern world and will probably help you to understand not only what's going on, but also why it's happening and why the decisions that are made by some of the big tech companies are being made. The next big idea is The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. Jonathan Haidt is someone I mentioned on the last episode, his book, The Happiness Hypothesis. Well, The Righteous Mind is possibly one of his most famous books. And this is about how intuitions come first, strategic reasoning comes second. This very much aligns with my book, Inner Propaganda. But in The Righteous Mind, Jonathan talks more about sort of the moral decisions and how we jump on a bandwagon, and morality is not just about harm and fairness. It's also about loyalty, authority. It's about sanctity, and the decisions that are made by someone that disagrees with you aren't necessarily wrong. And really, The Righteous Mind helps us to understand why we fight, why we argue with people over politics, over social justice. We're not judges seeking truth. We're lawyers arguing for our side. That's such an important critical point. Again, it's something I go deep on in terms of my work in inner propaganda. But he looks at the research out there that sort of shows we have conceptions of ourselves and we compare ourselves to the other side. And we often think, and he talks about the elephant and the rider again in terms of the metaphor that he used in the happiness hypothesis. But the writer often thinks that they're in control. So it's like our rational self, let's say, thinks that we are pressing the buttons and we're determining what occurs and we're driving the machine. But actually the elephant, the intuition that we have, tends to go wherever it wants. And our writer, instead of like actually taking control or influencing it, like we talked about in the happiness hypothesis, the writer tends to explain, oh, the reason why I'm going over here is because I want to go over here. So in other words, we use our brain to rationalize what we're doing as opposed to doing what it is that we want to do or going after what we want to achieve. And we oftentimes fight for our own side because we have a different in terms of moral foundation. Some liberals and conservatives have some different values that they work towards. And that's where a lot of times there's conflict, because while there's a lot that they might have in common, there's a number of things that they'll prioritize differently. So, for example, fairness is particularly important to someone on the left, right? And there's other factors like freedom, which is important to both, but you'll hear more people on the right talking about freedom. So the fact that other people at different points of view, different perspectives politically than us, should help us to understand that this doesn't come as a result of the fact that they're wrong and we're right. It comes because we are experiencing our own hive switch, as he would call it, where we become part of our own group and we tend to start to form the same kind of beliefs or morals as the folks that we agree with as well. So The Righteous Mind is an excellent book, really sort of dives into our moral framing, the way we think about things, and sort of suggests that understanding these different moral languages between people that disagree is the key towards resolving and bridging these political divides. The next book is Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. This is one of my favorite books, really enjoyed it. And in this particular book, Harari talks about how humans rule the world because we're the only animals that are able to work together in large numbers, and we're able to be flexible. And this is because we're able to believe in myths or stories that exist only in our collective imagination. So money is a story, human rights is a story, businesses are stories, nations are stories. There's lots of stories that we tell ourselves and we collectively agree on and all sort of work with. Even the rule of law is a story that we all have agreed to. And recognizing that means that we could start to understand where we're limited. And even the agricultural revolution, the scientific revolution, the cognitive revolution, these are all changes in the stories in terms of how the world works. So it's important to recognize the power of these stories, because whenever we want to make changes will lie in our ability or capacity to tell new stories to ourselves and agree on those stories. Next, we have The Shallows by Nicholas Carr. It's a very interesting concept about the internet not just being the tool, but actually rewiring our brains. Talks about neuroplasticity. And in many ways, we're kind of rewarding ourselves for short fixes. It's the whole notion of like, we get a dopamine reaction whenever someone likes our photos on Instagram or our videos or whatever. And so it's imperative that we're aware of the fact that the internet isn't just a tool we're using. It's actually affecting the way in which our brain works. And as a result of that, we also need to look at things like, for example, AI. And the danger with using AI for everything is that you're no longer using your brain. We need to recognize that the internet itself, social media, artificial intelligence, all of it affects our brain. And it doesn't mean we have to stop using it. It means we have to recognize what's going on to make sure that it doesn't have negative ramifications down the line. We also can look at The Status Game by Will Storr. There's a great writer who's written a number of books about storytelling, which we'll get to in a future episode. But in this particular book, The Status Game, Will Storr talks about status as being one of our master motives. Much of what we do and much of what we signal to other people is about playing the games of ranked. He talks about dominance, virtue, and success as being the three ways in which we try to increase our status. But if our desires or if our efforts in terms of being successful or our efforts in terms of being virtuous and being good don't work, will often retreat to dominance. And he sort of shows how extreme consumerism, political tribalism all tend to follow this sort of trend. In other words, if being, as you think of it, good or being successful doesn't work to get what you want, sometimes you'll resort to dominating, which is exerting power over other people and trying to force other people into doing things that you want to do. So Status Game, very interesting way of thinking about the world and seeing how the world works. Next, we have Scarcity by Malanita and Shafir. And this particular book looks at the power of this concept of scarcity. Now, obviously, Robert Cialdini in his book Influence talks about scarcity as influencing us to the point of it makes us want things more. But scarcity also has an impact upon the way in which we think. And so it tends to capture the mind and imposes sort of, as he calls it, a bandwidth tax on the situations we find ourselves in. In other words, it means that we're more likely to be guilty of what's called tunneling. We're less cognitively flexible whenever we find ourselves in a situation of scarcity. And therefore, we need to recognize this tendency, because the more that we tunnel, the less effective we'll be, the less smart we'll be. It reduces our capacity to be able to think through things and to be able to solve problems. It actually is being said to lose, some points of IQ in terms of our ability to be able to be successful mentally. So we need to recognize the power of scarcity. And scarcity isn't always something that might be true. It just might be that we feel a sense of scarcity, and marketing sometimes does that. It's like if you're the only person that doesn't have something, that can sort of create that for you. So we need to be on the guard for this feeling of scarcity and how that might impede our ability to think more successfully as well. The next book is Meditation for Mortals by Oliver Burkeman. This is really about understanding how we can retreat from the real world. We suffer, he argues, because we live in a sort of, whenever I mindset. Whenever I do that, then I'll be relaxed. Sahil Bloom, I know, talks about the arrival fallacy. This is not a million miles away from it. But the problem is that we'll always experience the chaos of life, and we must move away from the results-oriented mindset. Once I do this, then I'll be able to relax, and actually into a process-oriented mindset, which is how can I relax doing the thing? How can I relax in the chaotic world that I live in? And that's why the nice notion of meditation for mortals is that you're living in the world that is chaotic, and you're trying to relax in the world that we have, as opposed to waiting for some perfect world to arrive. Another great book by Oliver Burkeman is 4,000 Weeks. And this is obviously named after the fact that 4,000 weeks is more or less what the average lifespan will be. We've got 4,000 weeks in our life, and recognizing that we can never master time. We just have to clear things up in our own mind to the point where we can embrace the finitude, embrace the fact that we only have a certain amount of time, and we focus on where we put our attention. We stop rushing around, and we learn to ruthlessly neglect things. In other words, we learn to say no to certain things. And it's very different to a lot of time management books out there, which says, here's how to optimize, here's how to be effective. He's like, whoa, hang on a second. It's not about mastering time. It's about recognizing how much time you do or don't have, choosing where your attention goes, and most importantly, learning what to, as he puts it, ruthlessly neglect, which is an excellent way of thinking about the craziness that we face. Then we have Deep Work by Cal Newport. In this book, he talks about it in the information economy. The ability to focus without distraction is actually a superpower, and the importance of setting aside time for deep work as opposed to shallow work where you're responding or reacting to the world, reacting to emails, tasks performed when you're distracted. He says deep work is when you're really focusing in and you give yourself short spurts of time where you can do deep work, and you're much more likely to be a lot more productive as a result of that. So really great book, Deep Work, and helps you to focus a lot more. We've got another book by Jonathan Haidt, which is one of his newer books called The Anxious Generation. And in this one, he talks about how this shift to a phone-based childhood has rewired children's development and has created more anxiety, more fragility. There's a phone-based sort of social life, polarization, sleep deprivation. There's all sorts of negative impact that occurs, even a decline of play and unsupervised childhood independence. And it's really important that we take this seriously, and we do something I know recently. And maybe by the time that this episode is out, or by the time you watch this episode, this will have changed. But Australia started this new initiative on basically banning kids from using social media, I think under the age of 16. So we'll see how that experiment goes. But what's most important about this is that we need to take this seriously. There is an impact that being online all the time is impacting, and being on phone is impacting children. And it's impacting adults as well, but we need to start somewhere. Next, we have Selfie by Will Storr. Again, same guy who brought us the Status Game and the great books, which we'll talk about in terms of storytelling. But in this, he talks about over centuries, Western culture has built this like heroic self-ideal where, you know, you're hyper-individualized, you're optimized, you've got high self-esteem. And now if you don't succeed, if you don't reach that, then you are blamed for it. So it's this perfect self. And he talks about this as being something that's being continuously re-emphasized throughout Western history, and this pursuit of an idealized, flawless existence, you know, seeing all these characters which are perfect and have got no flaws, promoted through the media, movies about them, these superhumans and super spies or whatever. That is, and even self-help, promising you can only be better. It's something that will continuously challenge us and continuously make us feel lesser than. Right. So the more that we pursue this, the more it actually becomes quite difficult for us to deal with. Then we've got Same as Ever by Morgan Housel, who's also written a great book called The Psychology of Money, which we'll talk about in a future episode. But in Same as Ever, Housel talks about how we're obsessed with forecasting what will change. But actually, the most useful guide is to look at the fact that what has happened over the last 500 years will actually give you a lot of lessons about what's going to happen in 10 years. And he gives some great examples there. Like technology changes, of course, but human nature, greed, fear, tribalism, overconfidence, that happens all the time, and that's permanent. And because of that, you can know that even though technology will change, ultimately the human beings will still do whatever it is that they do. So the bones are really the human psychology, as opposed to the skin might change with the technology or markets or politics or whatever, but we will keep making the same mistakes as we always have. And there's another good book on the lessons from history. Will Durant, Lessons from History. It's a really old school book, but I think it's connected to Same as Ever in the sense of, I think it helps us to learn from some of the things of history to help us to be able to be ready for the future as well. The Tipping Point is the next one. This is by Malcolm Gladwell. Now, we recently released a book called Revenge of the Tipping Point, which is sort of an updated version of this. But the key idea is that social epidemics like ideas, products, or behaviors explode once they hit a certain tipping point, driven by a few key people. If the message is sticky enough, and the power of small changes can actually make a big difference. So he talks about connectors, who are people that have wide social circles, mavens, who are information specialists, and then salespeople, who are persuaders. And these people, combined with a sticky message and a supportive environment or context, tends to make an idea take off. And that was the original sort of concept. Blink was another one of Malcolm Gladwell's books, and this one he talks about how our snap judgments, our first impressions, can be actually very accurate, and sometimes they can be very dangerously biased, so we need to be able to recognize the difference. And they come from rapid, unconscious sort of what he calls a thin slicing of information rather than deliberate analysis. This is a lot of this research that supports this comes from Timothy Wilson, who has done a lot of work on this notion of sort of unconsciously incorporating or understanding the world. And the snap judgments we need to recognize can sometimes be super useful, and sometimes it can lead to biases or discrimination. So we need to reckon with that as well. David and Goliath is another one of Malcolm Gladwell's books, and this is about how the underdog can often win. And he gives some great examples, some great stories about how the underdog can sometimes beat the bigger, stronger opponent, and being able to find the hidden weaknesses in the big. It's the whole thing of Star Wars and finding the hole in the Death Star, but having power can sometimes be a disadvantage. And so he gives an example of dyslexia, which forces you to develop other kinds of skills. So once again, how can you start to figure out your greatest weaknesses and make them your greatest strengths? And then the final book here, which I'll talk about, is one more from the person who's known as being the big idea book writer, right? Malcolm Gladwell is known for this. And another book by Malcolm Gladwell is called Talking to Strangers. And this, he talks about how we are way worse at reading strangers than we think we are, because we default to trusting them, right? There's like the truth default theory where we tend to believe people more than we should. It's like a default to believe them. We're inclined to think that people are telling the truth. There's also the transparency principle, where we think that we can read their internal states from body language, and we also cling to simple stories as well. So because of these kinds of mistakes, we overestimate how good we are at reading strangers and understanding what state strangers are actually thinking. We can be good at reading people that we know and people that we have spent time with, but when it comes to strangers, we overestimate our ability. And it's important to recognize this, challenge your own assumptions about this, and then learn how you can get on better with the people that you meet for the first time. So again, just to give you a really quick review, Enshittification, the internet is getting full of rubbish because that's the way in which it works, and they're optimizing for businesses. The Righteous Mind talks about how so often we think that we're the rational ones, but actually most of us are being guided by our feelings and guided by other drives, and we're using rationalization to sort of back us up. Sapiens, we tend to be successful as humans because we're able to create stories that we all agree on. Shallows, the internet is rewiring our brains. Status game, we oftentimes will try to outcompete others, and we'll either use dominance, virtue, or success. And if success and virtue don't work, we'll use dominance, which is when we get into a little bit of bother. Scarcity, we tend to become tunneled, and we tend to become more rich than our thinking and not as smart whenever we feel a sense of scarcity. Meditation for mortals, it's really important for us to stop the whenever then I can relax mindset, and instead focus on relaxing in the process-oriented now. So we focus on dealing with what we have as opposed to waiting for the time that may never come. 4,000 weeks, we're not going to be able to get everything done. So we need to be able to accept the fact that we've finite amount of time, and just put our attention where we can and learn to be able to ruthlessly neglect what we don't need to do. Deep work, we need to give ourselves time to really focus on things. The anxious generation, being on phones is affecting our children in very powerful ways, and we need to recognize that. Selfie, which looks at how we have this idealized image of this perfect person, and we try to pursue it, and it's never going to be possible for us to achieve it, and that can do damage to us. Same as ever, the what has happened in the past is going to keep happening in the future because of human behavior. The tipping point, many of the social epidemics, when ideas take on, they take on because they reach a certain point where enough people are talking about it, the right kind of people are talking about it. It's out there in networks. It's a sticky message, and there's small changes that all add up to something big later on. Blink, our first impressions and snap judgments and thin slices of what's going on, tends to sometimes be really, really useful and wonderful and guide us in amazing ways. And then other times they tend to lead us down the wrong track. David and Goliath, we need to recognize that sometimes greatest weaknesses can become our strengths. And just because someone is bigger, stronger, more powerful, smarter, doesn't necessarily mean that they always need to win. And then talking to strangers, we're not nearly as good at reading people that we just meet that we think we are. So I'm hoping that this episode has helped you to look at the world and look at the people you meet and look at some of the conversations that you're having, and helps you to understand things a little differently. Definitely recommend, check out, obviously you're not going to buy all the books and read all the books, but pick one or two that struck you as things that you want to read more on. And I promise you, you will feel good that you have. They're all excellent books, great writers, and I hope that this serves you massively. For now, please rate and review if you like it. Let me know if there's any particular book that you feel also helped you to change the way you thought about the world. But for now, take care, be well. May the forces always be with you. And I will see you next time. Bye for now.